Have you ever wondered why the one person who seems emotionally distant keeps coming back to you in ways they can't even explain? Why someone who fears closeness still watches you closely, listens to you carefully, and remembers things about you that others forget? If you've ever felt this strange pull, you're not imagining it, because there is a rare dynamic that quietly forms between two very different people. One who protects their heart by building walls, and one who understands hearts so deeply, those walls almost become invisible. The avoidant lives behind emotional distance, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much, and learned long ago that feeling deeply was dangerous. So they withdraw, they create space, they keep control. It's how they survive. But then someone like you appears. Someone who doesn't rush in with demands, someone who doesn't panic at silence, someone who senses emotions others overlook. The super empath. You notice the pauses in their voice. You feel the tension behind their calm words. You see pain hiding behind their independence. And without even trying, you understand them. That's where something unusual begins, because most people walk away from avoidance. They call them cold, unavailable, impossible to love, but you don't. You stay curious instead of judgmental. You listen when they barely speak. And this creates something the avoidant rarely experiences: safety, real emotional safety. Psychologists studying attachment patterns have found that avoidant individuals often grew up learning that closeness leads to disappointment or pressure, so their mind builds a defense system. Distance feels safe, control feels safe, but when a super empath enters their life, that system becomes confused. Because your presence doesn't trigger their usual alarms. You don't push, you don't chase, you simply understand. And that understanding does something powerful. It disarms them. Slowly, quietly, almost without them realizing it. For the first time in a long time, the avoidant feels seen, not judged, not analyzed, just understood. And here's the part most people miss. Avoidants are incredibly observant. They study people carefully. They watch behavior. They listen between the lines. So while it may seem like they're distant, something else is happening internally. They're noticing you, your patience, your emotional depth, the way you sense things before they are spoken. And that fascinates them, because it challenges everything they believed about closeness. You feel safe, but also dangerous. Dangerous because your presence starts unlocking emotions they buried long ago. Memories, vulnerability, connection. The very things they spent years trying to suppress. And the more they feel this, the more complicated their internal world becomes. Part of them wants to step closer. Another part immediately pulls away. This is the quiet tension that forms inside an avoidant when they encounter a super empath. Curiosity mixed with fear, attraction mixed with caution. They may not say much, they may not show it clearly, but internally, something has shifted. You've entered a space very few people ever reach, not the outer layer they show the world, but the guarded emotional center they protect at all costs. And once someone reaches that place, the avoidant cannot easily forget them, even if they try, even if they distance themselves, even if they convince themselves it doesn't matter. Because what you offered wasn't pressure, it wasn't control, it wasn't emotional chaos, it was understanding. And understanding is the one thing avoidants secretly crave, but rarely believe they'll ever find. That's why the connection feels so intense, so confusing, so unforgettable. Because deep down, the avoidant recognizes something their mind struggles to accept. You see them completely. And once someone feels truly seen, something inside them begins to wake up. And once something inside them wakes up, it refuses to go back to sleep. That's the moment everything inside the avoidant begins to change. At first, it feels subtle, a thought about you appearing when they least expect it, a memory of something small you said, the way you noticed a feeling they never spoke out loud. They replay it again and again. Avoidants may hide their emotions from the outside world, but internally their minds are incredibly active. They analyze, they observe, they remember details most people overlook. And you become one of those details, not because you chased them, not because you forced closeness, but because you understood them in a way their defenses weren't prepared for. This creates something powerful inside their psychology, a quiet fascination, because the avoidant is used to emotional distance. They know how to manage it. They know how to keep people at a safe length where nothing can truly touch them. But you didn't approach them the way others do. You didn't demand answers. You didn't try to break their walls. You simply saw through them. And that changes everything. Because walls are easy to maintain when no one understands what's behind them. But when someone sees the hidden fears, the unspoken wounds, the parts they thought were invisible, the wall suddenly feels fragile. This is when the avoidant begins thinking about you more than they want to admit. Your empathy unsettles them, not in a negative way, in a way that feels strangely comforting and terrifying at the same time. Comforting because they feel understood, terrifying because understanding leads to closeness, and closeness is exactly what their survival instincts were trained to avoid. This creates a powerful internal conflict. Part of them wants to move closer. Another part immediately hits the brakes. They may pull back. They may become distant. They may suddenly act like nothing ever mattered. But here's the truth. Few people realize. Distance doesn't mean disinterest. Sometimes it means the opposite. When emotions become too strong for the avoidant nervous system, the instinct is to create space. Not because you meant nothing, but because you meant too much. Too much feeling, too much vulnerability, too much risk. And the strange part is, the more they try to suppress these emotions, the stronger those emotions become. Psychological studies on emotional suppression show something fascinating. When a person tries to push away a thought or feeling, the brain actually keeps returning to it more frequently. It becomes louder, more persistent, harder to ignore. So while the avoidant may appear calm, detached, or indifferent on the surface, internally, your presence keeps resurfacing. Your conversations, your kindness, the way you understood them without forcing them to explain themselves. Those moments become mental echoes, and those echoes grow stronger with time. This is where fascination slowly turns into something deeper, something harder to control, because the avoidant begins realizing something uncomfortable. You didn't just see them. You accepted what you saw, without judgment, without pressure, without trying to fix them. That kind of emotional experience is extremely rare for someone who spent years protecting themselves from vulnerability. And once someone experiences that level of acceptance, the mind remembers it, even when distance grows, even when silence appears, even when pride tries to convince them it didn't matter. Something inside them knows the truth. They felt safe with you, truly safe. And safety is the one thing the avoidant has secretly searched for their entire life. But here's where the story becomes more intense. Because while the avoidant is wrestling with these emotions internally, something else is happening on your side. Your awareness begins to grow. You start noticing the patterns, the closeness, the sudden distance, the emotional push and pull. At first, you try to understand it. You offer patience. You give them space. You continue seeing the good in them. But slowly, something inside you begins to shift. Your empathy is still there. Your understanding is still there. But your energy begins to change. because the super empath eventually learns something powerful. Understanding someone does not mean abandoning yourself, and the moment that realization begins to grow, the entire dynamic starts to transform. The moment your energy changes, the avoidant feels it immediately. They may not understand it at first, but something in the atmosphere between you shifts. For so long, your presence felt constant, calm, safe, predictable. You were the person who understood their silence, the one who didn't pressure them to open up before they were ready. That kind of emotional patience becomes familiar to them, almost comfortable. And now something is different. You're still kind, still calm, still emotionally aware, but you're no longer waiting. You're no longer bending your heart into shapes just to make someone else feel safe. That quiet change sends a shock through the avoidance emotional system. Because the one thing they never expected was losing the emotional space you created. Avoidants often assume people will either chase them or eventually leave out of frustration. They are used to that cycle. It confirms the belief they carry deep inside. Closeness never lasts. But when a super empath pulls back with calm strength, it breaks that pattern. You're not chasing. You're not angry. You're simply reclaiming your energy. And suddenly the avoidant feels something unfamiliar rising inside them. Anxiety, not loud panic, but a quiet emotional tension they can't easily ignore. Because for the first time, the control they relied on is slipping away. The dynamic is no longer centered around their distance. It's now centered around your presence, or your absence. And absence has a powerful psychological effect. When something meaningful disappears from a person's emotional environment, the brain begins to search for it. It scans memories, it replays interactions, it tries to understand what changed. That's exactly what begins happening inside the avoidant's mind. They think about the moments you understood them without explanation. They remember the way conversations felt easy with you. They replay the safety they felt around you. And suddenly those memories feel different, heavier, more important. Because now there is a real possibility that they could lose the one connection that felt genuine. This is where obsession quietly begins to grow, not the loud, dramatic kind people imagine, but the silent kind that lives inside the mind. The avoidant may still act distant, they may still maintain their calm exterior, but internally, something powerful is unfolding. You've become the emotional reference point their mind keeps returning to, because your empathy showed them a version of connection they didn't think was possible. A connection without pressure, without emotional chaos, without demands. And now that they've experienced it, their mind struggles with a difficult realization. It mattered. You mattered. More than they expected. More than they were prepared for. This realization shakes the foundation of their emotional defenses, because those defenses were built on one simple belief, that closeness is dangerous, that vulnerability leads to loss, that emotional dependence is weakness. But you challenge that belief simply by existing the way you do, calm, understanding, emotionally aware. You showed them that closeness doesn't have to feel suffocating, and that realization is both inspiring and terrifying for someone who spent years protecting themselves. Because once a new emotional possibility appears, the old walls begin to feel less convincing. This is the turning point few people recognize. The avoidant now stands at a crossroads inside their own mind. One path leads back to the comfort of distance, back to control, back to emotional isolation. The other path leads toward growth, toward vulnerability, toward risking the very thing they spent their life avoiding, real connection. And your transformation is what forces that choice into the open. When you stop chasing, something powerful happens. You stop feeding the old pattern. You stop proving the avoidance belief that they can keep distance without consequence. Instead, you create something new. Space. Space where they must confront their own feelings. Space where they must decide whether fear will continue controlling their life. And this is where your real power begins. Not the power to fix them, not the power to save them, but the power to change the entire emotional equation. Because the moment you choose yourself, the moment you stop abandoning your needs just to maintain connection, you become something even more powerful than understanding. You become irreplaceable. And the avoidant finally faces a truth they tried to avoid for a long time. Some connections only come once, and losing them is a risk that cannot always be undone. And once that truth begins to settle inside them, the silence between you starts to feel heavier than any conversation you ever had, because now they understand something they never allowed themselves to admit. Your presence was never ordinary, it was rare, the kind of emotional safety that doesn't appear often in a lifetime. And the mind of the avoidant begins doing something it cannot stop, revisiting you. They remember the way you noticed things others ignored, the quiet shifts in their mood, the tension in their voice, the moments when they were struggling but pretending to be fine. Most people never see those details. You did. And the deeper they reflect on those moments, the more uncomfortable a realization begins to grow. You didn't misunderstand them. You understood them completely. That level of emotional visibility is powerful, but it also creates pressure inside someone who spent years hiding behind independence, because being understood removes the illusion they relied on, the illusion that distance protects them, the illusion that they can live without needing anyone. Your empathy quietly exposed the truth they tried to ignore. They do need connection. They do crave understanding. They do want someone who sees them beyond the surface. And now that they've experienced that with you, their emotional world begins shifting in ways they didn't expect. The memories don't fade. They intensify. Small moments start to feel significant. The way you listened without interrupting. The way you stayed calm when others would have reacted emotionally. The way you never forced them to explain feelings they barely understood themselves. All of it begins forming a picture in their mind. A picture of a connection they didn't fully appreciate while it was happening. This is where regret often begins to grow. Quietly, slowly, because the avoidant starts recognizing something uncomfortable. You gave them space to be human, not perfect, not emotionally polished, just real. And instead of stepping into that space, fear made them step back. Fear of vulnerability, fear of dependence, fear of losing control over their emotions. But now that you are no longer standing in the same place waiting for them, the emotional weight of that fear becomes impossible to ignore, because distance no longer feels safe. It feels empty. And emptiness has a way of forcing people to face themselves. The avoidant begins confronting questions they avoided for years. Why did I push away the person who understood me? Why did I retreat when things started feeling real? Why does their absence feel heavier than my independence ever did? These questions create a powerful internal conflict. One part of them wants to protect their familiar emotional distance, but another part begins realizing that distance has cost them something valuable. Someone valuable. You. This is the moment where their obsession deepens, not because they want control, but because the mind cannot easily release what once felt emotionally safe. You became a reference point in their memory, a reminder that connection doesn't always come with pressure or judgment, a reminder that vulnerability doesn't always lead to pain. But here is the powerful shift that defines everything moving forward. While the avoidant is wrestling with these realizations, your path continues evolving. Your empathy remains strong. Your ability to understand people remains rare. But something inside you becomes clearer than ever before. Your heart was never meant to carry the weight of someone else's fear. Your empathy was never meant to become self-sacrifice, and your understanding was never meant to trap you in a cycle where you give endlessly while receiving uncertainty in return. This realization transforms the super empath, because the moment empathy becomes balanced with self-respect, something extraordinary happens. Your presence becomes even more powerful, not because you are trying to prove your worth, but because you no longer need validation from someone who is afraid of connection. You begin choosing peace, choosing growth, choosing people who are emotionally available enough to meet you halfway. And that quiet shift changes everything, because the avoidant finally sees what they risked losing, not just someone who understood them, but someone strong enough to love deeply without abandoning themselves, someone rare, someone irreplaceable. And that realization stays with them long after the distance grows, long after the silence settles, because the truth becomes impossible to escape. You were never just another connection in their life. You were the one person who showed them what real emotional safety looks like. And once someone experiences that kind of connection, forgetting it becomes nearly impossible. And that is the moment the truth finally becomes impossible to ignore. Because once someone experiences a connection that feels real, ordinary interactions begin to feel empty in comparison. The avoidant starts noticing it everywhere. Conversations that stay on the surface, people who talk but never truly listen, connections that look normal but feel emotionally distant. Something about it feels wrong now, because you showed them something different. You showed them what it feels like when someone actually sees beneath the mask. That kind of experience rewires the emotional memory. And emotional memory is powerful. It doesn't disappear just because someone pretends it didn't matter. It stays in the background, quiet, persistent, waiting. Sometimes it appears in the middle of a random moment, a memory of your voice, the way you understood something before they even explained it, the calm energy you carried when everything else felt chaotic. Those moments return again and again, not because the avoidant wants to obsess, but because the mind always returns to what felt meaningful. And deep down, they know something they tried to deny for a long time. You were meaningful. Not because you tried to impress them, not because you chased their approval, but because you gave them something rare in this world: emotional honesty, the kind that doesn't manipulate, the kind that doesn't perform, the kind that simply exists. And when someone experiences that level of authenticity, the illusion of emotional independence starts to crumble, because the avoidant begins realizing something that challenges everything they believed about themselves. They were never truly independent. They were just protecting themselves from pain. Distance wasn't strength, it was protection. Control wasn't freedom. It was fear wearing a disguise. And now that realization begins pushing against their old defenses, because the mind cannot unlearn what it has already felt. You showed them a version of connection that didn't suffocate them. You showed them a closeness that felt calm instead of overwhelming. And that realization plants a seed inside them, a seed that keeps asking one uncomfortable question. What if I pushed away the one person who actually understood me? That question becomes louder over time, because the more distance grows, the clearer the memories become, the quiet patience you carried, the emotional maturity you showed, the way you never forced them to become someone they weren't ready to be. You simply gave them space to exist. And space like that is rare. So rare that many people spend their entire lives searching for it. But here is the deeper truth most people overlook. Your power was never in saving them. Your power was in showing them what real emotional presence looks like. And once someone witnesses that level of presence, something inside them changes forever, even if they are not ready to grow, even if fear still holds them back, even if pride convinces them to remain distant. They remember, because authenticity leaves an imprint the mind cannot erase. But the real transformation was never meant to happen inside them. It was meant to happen inside you, because the super empath eventually discovers the most important truth of all. Your empathy is a gift, but it was never meant to become your burden. You were never meant to spend your life proving your worth to people who are afraid of emotional depth. You were never meant to shrink your heart just to make others feel comfortable. Your empathy was meant to connect you with people who recognize its value, people who meet your understanding with honesty, people who respond to your emotional presence with growth instead of fear. And the moment you fully embrace that truth, everything changes. Your standards rise. Your energy becomes focused. Your heart becomes selective, not closed, just wise. Because you finally understand that love should not feel like a constant struggle to be seen. It should feel like mutual recognition. Two people choosing to grow instead of running from what they feel. And when you reach that level of emotional clarity, something remarkable happens. You stop chasing connections that require you to abandon yourself. You start attracting connections that honor who you truly are. And suddenly the dynamic shifts forever, because the person who once tried to understand everyone else finally learns to choose themselves. That is the moment the super empath becomes unstoppable, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally realize their empathy was never meant to rescue others. It was meant to guide them toward people who are brave enough to love without fear. And the moment you become that version of yourself, something shifts in the world around you, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Because when a super empath finally stops giving their energy to people who fear connection, a new kind of clarity enters their life. You begin seeing patterns you once ignored, the emotional games, the quiet distancing, the half-present conversations that once made you question your worth. Now you see them for what they always were. Fear. Not your failure. Not your lack. Just someone else's fear of intimacy. And once that realization becomes clear, the hold those patterns once had on your heart begins to dissolve. You stop interpreting silence as rejection. You stop chasing explanations from people who cannot explain their own emotions. You stop shrinking your light to make someone else's comfort zone feel safe. Instead, you grow. You grow into the full depth of who you are. Your empathy becomes sharper. Your awareness becomes stronger. Your heart becomes wiser. And something remarkable happens inside you. You begin recognizing your own rarity, because empathy like yours is not common. The ability to understand emotions without being told. The patience to listen beneath the surface. The strength to care deeply in a world that often rewards emotional distance. Those qualities are rare. But rare things must be protected, not given away to people who are not ready to value them. And that realization transforms the way you move through relationships forever. You stop trying to unlock doors that someone else insists on keeping closed. You stop convincing yourself that potential is the same as commitment. You stop hoping that understanding alone will change someone who refuses to face their own fears. Instead, you redirect that powerful empathy back toward yourself, toward your own growth, toward your own peace, toward people who recognize the depth you bring into their lives. Because the truth is simple. Real connection does not require you to abandon yourself. Real connection does not leave you constantly questioning your value. Real connection meets your emotional depth with courage. Not avoidance, not distance, courage.